A warm welcome today. I have the privilege to interview for our renewal conversation Dr. Hermina Nedelescu. She's a Romanian-born neuroscientist. We have a neuroscientist today, and you're going to learn so much about science and the intersection with our world and the way we interact. Her research work is concerned with the neurobiological control of abnormal behaviors and brain functions relevant to human psychopathology. In other words, she is passionate about looking at the brain and how it manifests in ways when things are not going well for us. And the majority of this work is directed to understanding brain mechanisms that underlie substance use and abuse, with emphasis on approach and avoidance of drugged paired environments. In other words, our reaction, do I seek this or not, especially around substance abuse? And she does a lot of other research. She's been investigating the dysregulation that is caused by predator-induced PTSD. So when there is abuse, how that impacts the response in the one receiving the abuse, and that linked between PTSD and alcohol use. And she hopes to bring novel treatments into that arena. And also, she studies theology right now. She's doing her master in theology at the Center for Theology and Natural Science at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley. So she is using her expertise in neuroscience to develop a theological anthropology, meaning the study of human societies and cultures and their development on the Christian Orthodox tradition. That's her faith tradition, and that's mine as well. She's an instructor for Stepping Higher Inc., which is a faith-based organization founded by the County of San Diego Behavioral Health Center Department to teach and support clergy, pastor, and behavioral health providers who minister to people suffering from substance use disorder, substance abuse, or any other psychological addictions or mental illnesses. And she's actively involved at the state legislative level to protect adults from clergy-perpetrated sexual abuse. And she also co-founded the Process of Healing, a resource site for Orthodox Christian victims and survivors of clergy abuse. And she has a lot to offer. I met her at a conference, and I was very impressed by her studies and everything she's doing in bridging science and faith and bringing the knowledge of science into our day-to-day conversations. And I'm so delighted that she's here. And if you're a regular, I want to welcome you back. And if you don't know me, I'm Dr. Ioana Popa from Team for the Soul. And I want to welcome you warmly into Thriving in Christ show on YouTube and podcast for Christian women professional and servant leaders who want holistic self-care habits to thrive in Christ for the kingdom. And see if this resonates with you. Do you feel at times stressed, depleted on a busy treadmill with Sunday night blues in spite of loving what you do? Do you struggle to find the time to take care of yourself and sustain your high-level habits, although you've been trying all along? Do you experience blocks in achieving your highest potential for the kingdom, although you have big dreams in Christ? Are you worried that the needed self-care habits will add more to your mile-long to-do list? If this is you, welcome. This show provides you with practical tips to help you balance and align your body, mind, heart, and soul as you lead and serve in your vocation, family, and church, community, and beyond, and simplify your empowering daily habits from inside out so you can perform at your best every day, no matter the seasons of life. And tap into your God-given confidence and vision for life in order to thrive for the kingdom, serving others with peace and joy and balance using tips from science, psychology, spiritual care, and Christian faith. And if you're ready, let's dive in. Oh, warm welcome, Dr. Hermina. I'm so excited you're here. We met last November, I think. It was St. Phoebe's conference on deaconesses in the Orthodox Church, out of all things. And I know we just had lovely conversations, and we were planning for this for quite a long time because I'm really excited about your research. You are such a scientist and a researcher and such a big heart for Christian women. So I'm really excited. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Ioana Popa. It's nice to be with you in this context, and it was lovely to have met you in person at the St. Phoebe's conference last year.
Yes, and we found out they were both Romanian, so what a lovely surprise. This is so delightful. And I usually love in our renewal conversation to just start a little bit with your journey in Christ. Something, I mean, this is a place for Christian women, professional and servant leaders that love Christ. They love to give, they love to serve others. And I'm always inspired by other people's journeys to really get to that point to follow Christ. So, what was it like for you?
So I'll just very briefly mention, I grew up in the underground Orthodox church. It was not safe to go to church when I was there. I would go once in a while. My grandfather was a priest, so I actually served in the altar there with my brother as well on summer vacations. I didn't go to church very often, but we would meet. We would meet and pray at home. So this is what I mean by underground church. We had hidden books in my mom's library where we had theologians. I didn't have kid books. I had these Bible to read. That's how I learned to read. So yeah, so that's my upbringing. Then I came to the United States, and honestly, I didn't expect to be on this path that I am here today with this. I am indeed, this is a vocation, and I find myself working together with others in Christ, but I didn't expect to be here, nor was this planned, because so I'm a third generation scientist as well. My grandfather on another on my mom's side was analytical chemist. My mother was a clinical oncologist, and I went into biology and neuroscience. And I was just super curious. This is how I started, just curiosity of things in life, but in particular, how the nervous system works
Mhm.
in response to environmental stimuli. And I was initially very interested in just skillful motor skills,
Mhm.
neuromuscular junction stuff. But then I very quickly became interested in the central nervous system, primarily the brain, a bit spinal cord.
Mhm.
And just really, it's curiosity that drove me to keep studying. We have very long training, years and years, graduate school. There's undergrad, graduate school, postdoc, and so on. And then after all of this education is when, so I work with viruses to study the brain, and this was the switch for me. This is when I came online more publicly in the Orthodox Church, and this was with the start of the pandemic. And why? Well, because I make viruses in the lab. So it was a direct challenge for me as a scientist when I was hearing things like SARS-CoV-2 was made in the lab. As someone who has made viruses, and I know how hard it is to even put one single protein in there and make that virus work, I thought, how can it be possible? SARS-CoV-2 had like 20 plus proteins that all work so perfectly to infect. And I found that a challenge, a direct challenge to me, and I wanted to help other people because the general public and us scientists, what we do in the lab, there's a huge gap. So I thought maybe if I explain, people can learn how to be safe a little bit, not fear. It's a respiratory virus. We also at first didn't know a lot about it. And I don't particularly work with respiratory viruses. I work with lentiviruses. I work with rabies. As you know, it's not a very safe one. But I knew the infectivity, just how viruses infect mammalian cells. So this was the switch. This was really the beginning of quote unquote my vocation in the Orthodox Church. And that took place at, I suppose, in my late 30s. So
Mhm.
quite late.
Mhm. Mhm. Wow. So then it's so interesting. And I want to piggyback on something you said earlier. I'm so glad you mentioned the underground church. I heard about it and I've never met people in it because, being on the communist era on just more of a neutral plane, it's kind of lovely to hear about that sharing. And you're saying that through curiosity, went through the studying and then the virus. So was through education, right? Educating the public. It sounds like you've discovered that kind of passion and bringing into the church. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, and I already had an inclination for that, just being an academic scientist. So it was just applying myself to provide knowledge that I know from the laboratory, not only to the general public in general, which I've been doing, already, but specifically with the language that I know, specifically for Orthodox Christians. And for that, it was Gail Woloschak, Dr. Gail Woloschak, who's a scientist like myself and also a theologian, said, well, if you're going to do this, Hermina, you should study some theology. You need to know how to talk. So I have enrolled during the pandemic when we had to shut down all our
Mm,
experiments. I, wasn't able to run a lot of experiments. Many of our labs were doing COVID research where our PCR machines were being utilized for that, things like that. So I had some time and I joined the Graduate Theological Union, and I'm finishing up soon with a degree in a master's degree in theology through the Center of Theology and Natural Sciences at the Graduate Theological Union. So I'm more able now to speak to the Orthodox Christian about the science. Yeah.
yes, yes. And I think it's a bridge sometimes difficult a gap between science and psychology, I found, and Christianity in general, because there are so many, and I think vice versa, being with one foot sometimes in the scientific world myself, people ask me, why are you still a Christian?
Oh,
And
me too. I get that question all the time.
And then I'm in church and I'm like, that science is not working. Like, no, it's working actually. Right. And kind of on a quest of bridging that. Oh, this is so lovely. That's kind of what I try to do as well. This is so wonderful. And
Yeah.
it's a response in a certain sense from your starting to educate and whatnot. What did you find? Were people receptive or?
Yeah, the majority are. There are a few voices who are, I think, generally driven by fear and afraid. But, we have to remind people that even in the ancient history of our faith, people of faith and science was much closer than it is now. Even just look at the basic example of Basil the Great, who wrote the Hexameron. I mean, the way he speaks, I mentioned this in other interviews, the way he speaks about the observation that he sees around him, such as the tarsals of the elephant, why they're fused. He explains so that it can
He's like a
better,
biologist.
yeah, so it can better withhold the weight of the big animal. Then, he speaks about the ego and various things. But also, yeah, also Saint Macrina, or take a female there, she speaks of the soul with knowledge of the chemistry of that time. She speaks of, they did a lot of metal work then. So she speaks of the soul after we die. She says that it's like, imagine it as an amalgam of silver, right? So, they integrated the science of their time.
Absolutely, yes. And if you're listening to this and you're Christian Orthodox, I'm sure you heard of St. Basil and St. Macrina. If you're not, those are early Christians that are celebrated in the Eastern Orthodox Church, and they're such an example. And you're right, there's such a big there. It's amazing. They knew psychology, they knew science, obviously, with the information they had at the time. Um,
Yes.
this
And
is
we have new novel information now. And I feel like the scientific world and the tech world has really surpassed and gone, developed so fast
yes,
that now the gap is somewhat, you know, uh, big. And
growing.
it's very important for those of us, people of faith, who are also scientists, to
Hmm.
speak and try to bridge a little bit, I
Yes,
think.
yes, and that's why I'm so excited you're here. And I'm curious, tell me a bit about the journey with Christ. What was that like? I mean, your grandfather was a priest, right? And you
Mhm.
kept that faith during communism and coming here. Like, is there anything about that in terms of the curiosity or the study that inspired you in your relationship with Christ or vice versa?
I think what I can say is my experience directly, and it wasn't with Christ first. That was later. It was actually what I was taught is about Saint Mary,
Mm.
okay, the Theotokos.
Ah,
That was my first experience. In fact, I always prayed to her first before I discovered, oh, there's Christ too. I always knew Christ as baby Jesus, but then
yeah.
there's a lot more to it when I got it later in my 20s. But it was the experience I had during, I like to pray. joined in the church when I could, not a lot, but on these summer vacations, I was part of it.
And it leaves an impression, right? It's a
Yeah, it has a profound effect on you.
hmm hmm
I think it had a profound effect on me as a child, just being able to be part of it. But it's really the experience I experienced because there was so much fear around, right? Just living under that oppressive totalitarian regime, as you remember, where I never wore a cross. It was not so safe to claim this or that. My mom was, a scientist, so that was under government control. All the scientists were, so I couldn't really speak about my faith, but there were times where we would meet with other people, and it was these times of experience of prayer. I remember when I learned Our Father, it was these experiences were very profound, and I felt very close to God, to a divinity.
Oh,
Yeah.
beautiful. Wow. Yeah, it's so moving. And I don't know if you've experienced that in Romania, going in a bit of a tangent here, but it always impressed me the places of worship that has been alive and well, and people have been prayed for a long time. And like in Romania for centuries, you enter and something is different. There's a sense, there's a different, I don't know how to explain that. Like I grew up, consider myself an atheist, although cradle Orthodox. And but the church was right close to our school. So I would go on a Holy Thursday or different events, and I would be in there. All of a sudden, there was something different, that sense of reverence. Did you experience at all that? Not that you had to, but I'm curious.
No, this is exactly what I experienced. This extra special experience in these contexts,
Yes.
because like you, I also grew up in a very atheist environment there because we had to.
Had
It
to.
was not really safe,
Otherwise,
right?
off with our heads.
Yeah. That's what I remember. It was not safe. Don't wear a cross. Say you're a communist. I was a young pioneer. Maybe you were there. It's
Yeah, yeah,
that
of course.
with the red thing. So then, yeah, I did experience exactly this was the experience that I had. And I think this is why I remained a Christian, because of this experience in this atheist, very secularized environment that I was in.
Wow. So through your journey, I'm hearing correctly, and by the way, thank you for sharing. That was very, very moving. You were saying that you did your school and your graduate work and doing theology. How is this all coming together for you at the present
Yeah,
project you're
yeah.
doing? I know a little bit about that, but I would love to hear more and also for the listener to learn the amazing things that you're studying and researching it. Yeah.
Yeah, what a good question you had, because as you know, also as academics, we develop, we evolve over time. So I started out just being extremely curious how the nervous system works, how
Yes.
the brain works. And that took over a decade of study, well over a decade. I mean, we're talking about from 2002 to about 2000 like and 14. Okay, that's after undergrad, graduate work, and started my postgraduate work. So from this curiosity and knowing the basic function of how the brain and behavior work, and we still don't know exactly how it works, but we have a better idea. Then yeah, I started being really interested in disorders of the nervous system. And that was even around 2007 already. I was beginning to be interested in fear learning, leading to PTSD, anxiety disorders, and the neurobiological changes that take place in the amygdala with that fear learning. And then I
The way, if you're
really,
listening to this, amygdala is that brain center for fear and for anger. It's a God-given center. We have it for a reason, but
yeah,
it can go off the balance. And you're saying that's what you're studying. Wow.
I started studying, yeah, this emotional center, amygdala, but really I study all various brain regions because
Mm,
within about five synapses, all brain regions are connected with each other in the
okay.
brain.
I never thought about it that way. Wow, so cool. Within
Yeah,
five connections, five synapses.
yeah. Yeah, and sometimes there's direct connection, right?
Right.
Uh, like there are direct connections between the prefrontal cortex and the some nuclei in the amygdala. But
Okay.
within no more than 5, everything's connected with everything. So I couldn't stay in the amygdala. I had to really study multiple disynaptic regions. And in fact, I study neural circuits of reward now. But what I wanted to say how I developed. So from this curiosity, I began to be interested in disorders of the nervous system. And then I really, about almost 9 years ago, got into being interested in drug use and abuse,
Mm-hmm.
um, substance use disorders. So I work with both opioids and alcohol. And yeah, so in this area of addiction. And then from there, I evolved. And this was simultaneously also when, like I said, I came online to speak about viruses during the pandemic. And this was simultaneous development with doing some theology work. And I got really interested in clergy perpetrated sexual abuse and just abuse, spiritual abuse of power as well. Not
Mm.
necessarily sexual each time, but also just abuse of power. So this, yeah, this was my evolution.
And can I pause for a second? So was that the research on perpetrator, right? Is that the impact on the brain, or was that on a clinical level? In other words, in working with people directly or in studying the brain, or both?
Both.
Both.
Yeah, so I'm now designing some experiments for predator-induced PTSD development with alcohol comorbidity. And that's dependent on clinical research because I have a clinical collaborator who has showed that survivors of clergy abuse, a certain percentage of them, it's actually nearly 40%, develop PTSD. And of those, again, nearly another 30% of those, 40%, it's actually 38% of those begin to self-medicate with alcohol and other drugs of abuse. So I think, yeah, this is new work. And I do want to look at the neurobiological changes that takes place because these individuals who are exploited in this way, in particular by clergy who represent God's messenger on earth, and it's really messing up with that relationship that they have with God,
Right.
okay, with the self that goes beyond the self and with God, which is really interesting to have this conversation with you because you're a psychiatrist, so you understand this. I want to look, okay, so there's immense behavioral dysregulation in these individuals who
Mhm.
are exploited in this way. That's why they cope with drinking, some cope with overfeeding, some cope with underfeeding. There's a whole array of behavioral disturbances.
Mhm.
And what is not appreciated is that the suicidality rate is extremely high.
Oh, wow.
So it's worth looking to see what changes take place so that we can, and where are these changes taking place? And I have a way to look both preclinically and then, of course, together through collaborations clinically. We are much more limited in terms of what we can see in the brain with clinical experiments right now.
Like with people, right? Is that what? MRI, CT scan, things like that?
Yeah, we're limited, and that doesn't give us the resolution that I need. Because, for example, if we're speaking about neurons in the amygdala connected to the prefrontal cortex, this decision-making process
Right.
center.
Right here, the frontal lobe. Yeah.
Yes, and as you well know, in humans, there's been an expansion of the prefrontal cortex,
Right.
right? The way it helps us to make decisions and so on, goal-directed
Mhm.
decisions. If we are speaking about trying to study those neural circuits invasively, I can't do that in humans because say that a person who's exploited has overactivation in the amygdala because we know stress overly activates the amygdala. Well, what about if we shut those neurons down? We can't do that in human, but we can do it in animal studies. We shut them down and we see now, is the stress ameliorated? Are they pressing less for the lever, drinking less, for example?
If the neurons are shut down, are there addictive behavior going down?
We have been able to do those experiments, not in this context with
Of course.
predator, but yes, we have been able to silence these neurons and these behaviors do go down. We've done it in other contexts, not with predator-induced stress.
Yeah.
So
So
it's new research. It will come out. It's at some point.
yes, and I know we were talking a bit before this about medications and therapies. My sense, and I'm curious, as you're a scientist and you're researching this, my sense, I've seen transformation in different ways, right? For many of these are let's say for people, they have different experiences, traumatic or loss, or all sorts of or conditioned behaviors from their early childhood. And there's a way to rewire the brain. And sometimes medications are needed, and sometimes there are particular ways and psychological methodologies that can be used in therapies or even in coaching that can shift those. Do you have a sense of, is it just through medications, or could be also through therapeutical conversations or shifting attachment? I am curious, like, if you have any thoughts on that.
So much of my PhD was doing development. I study development. And as you know, there's immense neuronal plasticity in
Yes.
doing development. Immense. I mean, you can even see, I'll give you an example.
If I can just time out for a second, the neuroplasticity, meaning that the brain, the nerves can shift, they shift the connection. So if you're listening to this, this is a term that's commonly used as researchers and scientists. So neuroplasticity, and you're giving some examples?
Yeah, so it's often misused, the term. It's used all the time, but
Yes.
there are differences because there
Mm,
is a lot of neuronal plasticity, meaning there are changes, electrophysiological changes of the neuron, neurochemical changes, and also making new connections.
yes. The
Um,
synapse
okay,
that you were
at the
talking.
synapses with other neurons. And this happens a lot more in the early phases of development. Maybe you remember your child when they were little, they could not reach properly for a toy, right? So they reach with these fingers as well. So that's as these neural pathways, and there's a specific neural pathway that is being formed
Yeah.
as they learn to reach and they shift to the opposable thumb. And it's particular involving from the spinal cord, the C regions, to the lateral reticular nucleus in the brainstem to the cerebellum. There's this neural pathway that is being formed. And then once it's there,
The neck all the way to the back of the brain and the top of the brain. Yeah.
yes, and then of course there are connections with the prefrontal cortex so that you can think, I'm going to reach for that glass
Yes.
of water.
I'm going to actually think about it.
Yeah. So that's an example of where there was, not all the connections were there, but then they're being formed. But I want to be very careful in saying, there's not a lot of neurogenesis in the adult. There is some, but the studies show that there's neurogenesis in the hippocampus and the olfactory cortex. So that's for smell. And the
Memory
hippocampus,
now.
yeah, so the hippocampus is like our GPS center, as you know. It tells us, we remember how we get home that way. So that's primarily in the adult where there's neurogenesis, but there's a lot more neurogenesis in the young, especially pre-birth as well. And then there's also the pruning that we have to talk about, which happens pre-adolescence and during adolescence. So, the adolescence is a very special period. There are a few points throughout development where there's a huge amount of synaptogenesis, new connections being formed, and then there's pruning, right? And that doesn't happen at our age. And it's also wrong to say that the brain is completely immutable at our age, but we don't have the same neuronal plasticity that a
Right.
child had. This idea of, oh, it's so easy to rewire, then we would be able to, cure a lot of the mental illnesses much quicker, but it's not so easy to rewire. It's not so easy to rebalance our neurochemistry, actually. So therapy does take a long time, which
Yeah.
is, yeah.
And changes. Coming from my medical school 30 years ago, what we were taught was like, there is no brain plasticity ever, no changes. As I understand this, is just right, there's no new neurons formed, but there are new connections. The interesting phenomena that I've seen was I'm using internal family system and psychosynthesis, there are profound shifts that happen. So not all psychological methodologies are equal. There's some that actually get to a place where we see profound shifts happening. And yes, it's not about new neurons necessarily, but I think there is something, and it does take time.
Mhm.
Absolutely, it does.
Yeah, and there is neurogenesis in the adult, but hippocampus and olfactory cortex primarily. Um, and there are new connections being formed with new experiences as well. But then there are also connections that are there long term.
Yes.
And we know this because we've put, a little lens. This is an animal work of adult on an animal, and we recorded with the camera to see. So we have experiments where you can see some of the synapses, some of the filopodia on, these are called spines on the dendrites. The spine connects to an axon. That's how a connection is made, a synapse is made. The dendrites are they are the part of the neuron that receive information. The axon is the one that sends. So these filopodia, these spines, if you look for like 3 weeks in an animal with this microscopy lens, you can see that some spines reach out, others retract, while others remain. That's like on the minute scale, while others remain there for the entire 3 weeks. So there are some tight connections, immutable, but others do change as well. There's both going on. Um, but yes, I do know what you mean, that there was the idea that the brain, adult brain doesn't change, and that's not entirely true. But at the same time, we can't say that there's a ton of neuronal plasticity and you can just fix anything very quickly and rewire the whole thing. That's not true either.
Right, right. Yeah, well, thank you for sharing. So I know you had also some research on dysregulating behaviors, and my focus is a lot on rituals and how to develop in a certain way habits by not just pushing through our consciousness, our left brain, our logical brain, but also training our subconscious that it becomes effortless, it becomes through habits. And I'm curious, any tips about that? Like, as listeners are here, what
Mhm.
are some of the discoveries that can help us understand how our impulse control is developed, how our habits are developed? Anything about self-care or any other nuggets that you have?
I've thought about this a bit. I do a lot of habituation in the lab.
Yes, I love that's one of the things that I teach a lot. There is habituation on so many levels.
Yeah. Um, those are the rituals and habits are the two that I didn't have much to say, even though here in this interview, even though I use habituation in all my experiments, and I'll tell you how I use it. I use it because when I need to do the conditioning phase, these subjects need to be habituated to their
Yes.
environment. But in terms of personal and ritual, the only thing I will say about that is that it's important to have a regular schedule, but I wanted to comment a little bit more on the self-care. And
Yeah.
I do have some things I can share there that I think are important for women and just, and any individual in general.
Please.
So my things would be first, and maybe sleep would be first, but I put it here second. But the one of the first things is to be hydrated. I think so many people are not hydrated, and also sleep. Maybe
Mhm.
sleep would be the most important. As you know, when there's stress and when there's a problem, sleep is often disturbed. And with little sleep, that also exacerbates even mental illness, So I think the focus, yeah, I think if one is having sleep issues, it would be a good idea to consider what is like assess their life a little bit, because it's so important. We might be having a bad day, but then if we have a good night's sleep, we wake up and we feel so much better, right?
Yes.
But when there's ongoing chronic stress and there's insomnia that seeps in, then sleep is disturbed, and that just exacerbates the stress
Mhm.
even more. So I would say for self-care, sleep, hydration, eating well,
Yes.
exercise. And exercise is an important one. It doesn't have to be very strenuous exercise. It's really using of big muscles of so
Mhm.
that you can breathe deeply, because I remember in graduate school, a psychiatry professor was saying, actually, panic attacks, you'll notice that the person is breathing very shallowly.
Mhm.
And, you know, if you consider that neurons need so much oxygenated blood, they need oxygen. Neurons die without oxygen very fast.
Mhm.
And if we are stressed, we tend to breathe very shallowly, and that doesn't allow enough oxygen throughout the body, and it can lead to more serious anxiety, panic attacks.
That's a great observation and length and tip. If you're multitasking, come back. So there's something about the oxygenation and just breathing more deeply, right? And not necessarily force, but more deeply as we need the oxygen in the brain. And I love what you said about the food as well. I mean, it's interesting that the brain is the only organ that doesn't have reserves of like other tissues in our brain. So it really relies on the sugar level in the blood.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
it's very demanding. It
Yeah.
is really, I mean, try to study for 8 hours. You'll be so hungry because it really needs sugar. And it's the astrocytes that often provide this glucose for them. But yeah, eating well is important. And it's one thing we can control. Uh,
Mm. And the water, how is that impacting the nervous system?
Yeah, so that is my personal one because I have a heart arrhythmia. And so it's called supraventricular tachycardia. About 30% of people have heart arrhythmia, 33. So I notice it very quickly. When I'm dehydrated, even a tiny bit, the heart will not beat properly.
Wow, such a cool tip. Yeah, absolutely.
That's from a personal,
The
because
personal, yeah.
I'm affected so easily, but I think really to be hydrated on proper electrolytes or water, you know, maybe not Coca-Cola.
Yes, that's
I
right.
think I think being hydrated is critically important.
Yes. And I don't know about you, but I've noticed that habitually I would have a reach for coffee when I was tired to only discover after decades there was actually water. I'm
Ah,
actually
yeah,
drinking
you were thirsty.
much quicker I would become alert versus with the coffee and whatever. You get coffee and tea and then you're hungry and then you just get into another loop here. But yeah,
Yeah, we even reach for food to get hydration if we're not careful and we're dehydrated.
yeah, say more about that. That's so cool.
It's just, you know, we might not know we're thirsty, but we are reaching for a piece of fruit or something like that. It's just
Yeah. It's kind of like the same with the coffee. And my guess is that also when we're super busy, right? If we're very involved in what we're doing, let's say in our work or family or church or giving, we don't have necessarily time to really learn what the cues are. It's kind of like what I'm reading between the line you're saying, right? So if I might get some information that something is missing, I'm gonna reach for the food when actually I might need water. Is that
yeah,
right?
correct. Because by the time you actually feel thirsty or your lips are dry, that's already too late. You're dehydrated at that point.
Oh, that's a cool way to think.
Mhm.
Yeah.
It's good to know. And yeah, and it helps because you've asked about self-care. It helps skin as well to
Yeah.
be hydrated.
Yeah. So cool. Any other tips in general? I mean, from all your studies of the brain and any other tips or
Yeah, I think here we covered, you know, dealing with stress as someone who works in a high stress environment. This is what this is. Academic science, it pummels you. So you learn a few things. I think one of the things that helps is really to be in the nature for me. There's something that just grounds you to be in a field of grass or here we have beaches. We don't have many forests because everything is brush. It's very short, but just to be in the nature is um, very relaxing, and there's an awe for a lot of what's around. I that would be another tip. And
Mhm.
I do have one more, and that is an important one, and it is to connect with other people, to connect with friends.
Mhm.
I think you would appreciate that as well in your field, because we're not so healthy when we are alone. and isolated. And I think just having interactions with loving people is key to being mentally healthy as well.
Yeah, wow. Thank you so much for all the wisdom. And I appreciate you. And I wonder I know you had some resources also or things that are going on right now that would be of interest. I know you work with legislators. I mean, you do so many things. Like, tell us a bit of what are some of the work that you're doing currently, and if there's ways, I know you have resources as well available for
Yeah, I
people.
do, and I shared some of those with you. I would say some of the resources, and they're not necessarily my resources, but I would recommend, you know, I advocate for the role of women in the church. That's why I was at the St. Phoebe's Center. I would share my colleagues' research, for example, and the book that Carrie Frederick Frost wrote,
The granddaughters of our granddaughters.
Search of Our Granddaughters. Yes, I'm sorry. That's the one I would recommend, that one as a resource, because I think it can give girls, it busts some myths, but it could give young girls and even young women a self-worth, a healthy self-worth. And she does it beautifully theologically, where she focuses on the incarnation. She categorically, says that Christ's divinity, there was no biological sex in Christ's divinity, just in his humanity. So she centers this theologically on this on the incarnation. It's just really beautiful. It's simple to read, so I would share that as a resource. Second would be the resources through Axia Women uh, and St. Phoebe's, where I myself gave a presentation there, and I gave you that link, where I address the exclusion of not only young girls, but also women from church environments. And there have been studies done in congregations, Christian congregations, they were not Orthodox, but Christian congregations, that show congregations which exclude women from desired participation on governing boards, or even the more liturgical life, like in the liturgy, in the service. These women reported quite poorly on self-reported health surveys. So their health is diminished. But there's a study that shows in controlled environments, the exclusion of participants leads to activation of pain neurocircuits in the brain. And so it's just emotional pain from exclusion was able to elicit an activation in these pain circuits, in the same way that when these subjects, the hand was placed in very hot water, so they were experiencing physical pain, the same neural circuits were activated as when these participants were excluded. So we have clinical evidence that when there is, desired participation, but there's exclusion, there is activation of pain neurocircuits, and these are overlapped with physical neurocircuitry, right? That sense pain. So now, of course, put that in the context of a young adolescent who wants to participate in a procession or wants to hold a candle, then she or he is experiencing that exclusion pain in
Yes.
the brain. This is emotional distress.
Right. And it feels exactly like physical pain. This is the key.
Correct.
That exclusion or ostracism or whatever it is, on all sorts of degrees, it's experienced like physical pain. Yeah. Thank you for that.
Yes, yes, and there's reason for this, because evolutionarily organisms were able to, this is what's proposed, to feel sensational pain first, because emotions developed later. And so just using the same circuitry there, and that's one theory.
And I think this is what's so important in general, about women, because we're so connected and we love the community. We love to make sure everyone is included. We want to make sure that everyone is a participant, right? I mean, that's why many times many Christian women burn out because they're trying to help. They're trying to always, they sense the pain. They don't want to have people excluded. And at the same time, to actually receive that, sometimes a rejection. I mean, that it's devastating, right? Here I am giving of myself, and now I'm not accepted to taking care
And
of.
yeah, I'm most concerned with the adolescent, like what we're doing to adolescents, because they are at a critical developmental stage. But as I mentioned with the other study, women as well in congregations that are excluded are reporting poor health.
Mm,
So we just have to be aware. We have to get the conversation going, practice self-care, which is what we spoke about later. Just be aware and help each other, connect with each other,
mhm.
and
That's it. Yeah. Thank you for that. That's wonderful.
and I think this needs to be highlighted because often we can't pinpoint it and we can't name it. But this exclusion causes emotional distress and it does affect women's health. And I think women should know about it.
Mhm.
So there are some resources there, but I would say Carrie's book is the first, and then some of the videos and recordings from Axial Women and St. Phoebe's would be second. And then the other one, in terms of the more, severe abuse, I would really recommend the book Soul Mending by John Chrysavgis.
Mm.
His chapter on spiritual misconduct and abuse, chapter 8, there is really quite good. And he's an Orthodox Christian that can be used as a springboard to some of my work, which is more new. His book was written 25 years ago. Carrie's book is quite new. And my work, I really integrate the science and what we know about spiritual abuse there. So I think that would be a way, those resources would be in that order. Important to provide education.
Mhm. Wow. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Such a beautiful, so much wisdom and so much. I love the integration between science and the love for. It almost seems like a love for justice. There's a
Well, the Bible is about justice too.
right, right. There's a sense of here is a science. Not take things for granted. Let's think it through. Let's think and take all the resources that are available in research and experiences, and let's bring the truth. I've seen that as well as you're talking about the viruses, right? There's a sense of, wait a second, there's some misconceptions here. We need to really speak the truth in love, but speak the truth. And
Yeah.
that's a beautiful inspiration.
Yeah, be and that's the true meaning of humility as well, because as new things and as we learn new things, then we adjust. If we were wrong about the virus, we were wrong, we admit it. That is a true sign of humility
Right.
there. But we do have to speak truth with the knowledge that we have. And we have quite a lot of knowledge that I hope we can integrate more.
And I feel the same on my line of work has been realizing in my study that many times we talk about spiritual growth as Christians, which is wonderful and lovely. But if we just push only through spiritual growth and not psychological growth, we go into spiritual bypass. We
Yeah.
use spirituality as a way to address whatever it might be needed, and it's not fully matured or developed. And if you, of course, if we just focus on the psychology, we miss the spirituality piece, right? So we're missing God, and we just try to stay aligned and healthy and whole, but there's nothing beyond that. So I think that is a bridge. And sometimes I see that as a misconception that we're only going to focus on one or the other, when in fact it's kind of like going back and forth. And I'm going to give a resource just thinking about this, Stages of Faith by
Mhm.
Fowler, James Fowler. He does a fantastic job looking at developmental psychology, like cognitive development, emotional development, social development, moral development, along with the spiritual development. He developed quite a beautiful framework that I've been using and testing, and it makes absolutely sense. So I love what you're doing as bringing that amazing curiosity and love for how God created our brain. Like, this is it. We're very intimately connected with the creation in that way, in such a tiny, tiny, tiny way. And I mean, the level of microscopic changes, and it's just so beautiful to bring that into the world. So thank you for
You're
you.
welcome. Yeah, let's continue to integrate because I
Yes.
think the spiritual component, the physical component, and the emotional, psychological component, all three have to be integrated. Otherwise, because we're a whole human being.
Exactly, and aligned, yes. And if you're listening to this and you're not in the Christian Orthodox world, just a quick background. In some of the in Christian Orthodox tradition, the women are not participatory in the services. I mean, they are in indirect ways, okay, maybe being ushers or whatever, but not necessarily in this actual service, which is so different than some Protestant. So if you're listening to a Protestant, you're like, well, what's that about? Of course the women are involved. Well, let me tell you that there's still debates and still discussions about it, but this is where I appreciate your work, because bringing these kind of research to the surface and the impact it can have on the psychological and health development on women and girls, especially if if there's also abuse, that it makes it so difficult, so difficult.
Yes, yeah, I think we need to name it better because according to the World Health Organization, the CDC, rejection is maltreatment, and maltreatment, according to the literature, is abuse. So we need to be able to name it because when an 8-year-old wants to hold a candle and she's not allowed to because she has an XX chromosome, then
Yes.
that's a problem.
Yes,
And
yes.
that's not what our theology says anyway.
Right, right, exactly. Wow. Well, so many nuggets. I hope you, if you're listening, you come back. There's a lot of beautiful, and I love the scientific explanations as well. And as if you're listening, you type in the chat if you have questions or comments, so we can totally address that. But thank you so much, Dr. Hermina. It's been so wonderful, and I hope we'll do this again.
And thank you kindly. We shall continue the conversation.
Yes, yes.
Ioana
Yeah.
Popa. Thank you.
Thank you. You're welcome. Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Hermina, for what a wealth of information, of knowledge and wisdom and expertise. I am so honored to know you and to hear from you, the way you explain, the way you studied and go into the way God and learn patterns of how God created our brain. This is so important. We need researchers and neuroscientists like you that can shed light into what is happening at the level of our brain functioning that will actually reverberate and will have huge impact in the way we interact and the way we encounter our day-to-day experiences. So thank you for what you do. And as a listener, I want to thank you for your attention. And I hope that the nuggets that you received today were helpful about self-care, but also the overarching encouragement that as a Christian woman, your voice matters. So it is important to find resources that can help you, that you can actively pursue your dreams and your goals because you matter. And then you can go ahead and inspire other women so that together, like murdering women at the tomb of Christ, we can serve the world and we can bring God's glory in today. So with that, I'm going to end with a short prayer. Dear God, thank you so much for everything you do for us. And thank you for Dr. Hermina. She's such a wonderful, brilliant scientist, and love her passion for the church, of passion for women. And may we continue to bless her and in all that she's doing, and also bless the listener. May she be shower her abundantly with your love, with your compassion, with your resources in such a way that she can lean onto you, she can trust you, and continue to grow from glory to glory and continue to serve and give to others with joy and peace that surpasses all understanding. And with that, I thank you for all you do. And until next week, I say goodbye for now. Be well.